Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Dave, and this time round we've got something completely different from anything that we've done before. We're going to talk to a wonderful man who has written an academic paper on bleed, which is a subject that we're all very interested in, as we're LARPers. David, do you want to introduce yourself and maybe give a bit of a background on some of your nerdier stuff before we get into the academics?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dave. My name is Davide Orazi. I'm a senior lecturer in consumer psychology at Monash University in Australia in the Department of Marketing. Now, marketing is a bad word in the imaginary of many people, but it encompasses different traditions. It has psychology, it has anthropology. So my research is mainly the intersection between these two fields. And in the LARP side, what I do is trying to understand how we can use this context to derive processes that happen in this specific consumption context and apply them to broader ones. And in this case, LARP. But Dave's question was about my nerdy side before. Well, I'm a nerd.
Let's hear your credentials, man. You got to prove yourself to the audience before we start.
I am a nerd since 1996, when I played my first session of Dungeons & Dragons First Edition in the kitchen of my apartment with a couple of friends, and I think I died. We had a respawn close. I died 5 times within 2 hours. I was so bad. But for some reason, I was playing an elf. There were no classes in First Edition, so you had 4 human classes and then races, halfling, elf, and dwarf. And elves were basically, warrior spellcasters, and I was playing this chaotic elf really, really badly. But for some reason, I became enamored of that game, and then I started playing Dungeons & Dragons until the 3rd edition, and then moved to Vampire at a certain point. In my 20s, I got like a dark turn, I started playing a demon.
That says a lot about you, man. I'm not here to judge, but yeah.
Yeah, no, at a certain point, for some reason, somebody convinced us that Dungeons & Dragons was too childish and we had to embrace darkness. And so I started playing Nosferatus for years. And that got translated into LARP a year later because I thought, this is very... Whereas Dungeons & Dragons is a little bit harder to do live, you can, but the suspension of disbelief is a little bit more complex. With if you play a Game of Thrones vampire political LARP style, you can do that much more easily. You don't need an evocative location. You can do it in an underground, in a basement somewhere. So yeah, that's what happened. And then through the years, I kept playing that until I moved to Australia. And then when I was in Australia, I realized I never played an intensive LARP that goes for 3 days. And I became fascinated and research question about what can we learn from LARPs that actually helps academia, companies, and people. Are there relevant things? And we had 2 projects. The first one was how do people learn to improvise? And how does LARPing make you a better individual in terms of honing your reactive and proactive improvisation skills? That was published last year in Administrative Science Quarterly. And then this year, and the reason why you contacted me is Bleed, which is LARPers have a prime experience of the challenge of going into another world and returning from it. And that transition happens to different scales in every journey that we go through. Like when we come back from a holiday, when we recover from a relationship breakup, when you come from a study abroad period, when you're a volunteer in the Peace Corps and come back. So there's a lot that we do constantly as LARPers because we simulate different lives, different worlds. And that is something that's very clear and understandable for people who LARP, who play role-playing games, but not so much for maybe those people. And so we are using these insights to also illuminate some of these similar processes that happen into these other contexts.
Sure. And how did you kind of start with trying to gather information to try and gain information on this sort of subject? Where do you kind of start? What sort of questions do you ask? What sort of research did you do to kind of try and draw some of these conclusions that you're talking about?
Well, we use ethnographic methods and we use grounded theory, which is a method that implies that you are constantly iterating between existing theory and the data. So at the beginning, we didn't even start with the bleed question. At the beginning, we were just interested in see how people live and appropriate narrative worlds that are branded, because we were studying a Game of Thrones LARP. And our question was to what extent people that play such a Game of Thrones LARP for 3 days and live different storylines in a narrative that is still unfinished, how they integrate it and complement in the overall lore that's based in Game of Thrones, right? To us, that was a magnificent question. The journal did not believe so. So across many rounds of review, of course, you have to shift and to find compromises between what you think it's interesting and what the discipline wants. And one of the elements we included in the first draft was also mentions about Bleed, because when we were talking about all the prerequisite to enter the Game of Thrones world, so what you need in terms of scenography and role, how these overlap into the material structure that is subjectively perceived reality, and the roles you play. But then, of course, the question was, then what happens when all of this baggage that you have to take on to enter the world comes with you out in everyday life? And that appeared to be the most interesting question, because surprisingly, there is a lot of literature on Renaissance fairs, reenactments, other extraordinary experiences since the 90s, but it's mainly focused on how people enter these domains and what happens within them. And it's also very focused on the communities that it produces, but for some reason it stops most of the time with the end of the event. There's like very little mentions about what happens afterwards. Now, I'm saying the extraordinary experience literature because there are other literatures. There are some scholars that do specifically role-playing that mention Bleed, characterize Bleed specifically to LARP, but what we were looking at is talking with people that are LARPing to try to figure out a broader phenomena, a broader trajectory of return that is applicable to other phenomena.
Yeah, and so could you give examples of other some other of these like extraordinary experiences that you kind of reference in the document, and how they are different from LARP, but maybe how they some experiences might have similar traits as an experience?
Oh yeah, so like let's do 3 examples. One would be cosplay. There is a paper by Uzva Seregina and Henry Wajo in the Journal of Consumer Research. They are looking at cosplay. It is a type of extraordinary experience in that so let me define extraordinary experiences, which are extraordinary experiences are intense physically and emotionally. They are engaging in that they require engagement with a certain framework, like a setting, like the Lord of the Rings will be like a setting you engage with. And they're also temporally limited, so they start and end within a constrained period. So cosplay is considered an extraordinary experience because you take on a character, it's limited in time, and in a way you're engaging with the frame of reference, which is pop culture most of the time. Another paper was Tough Mudder, people that do the Spartans race and go for obstacles and subject themselves to enormous pain to try to let's say compensate a 9-to-5 office life. That would be another extraordinary experience because, again, it's temporally limited, it's very intense, physically especially, and it's engaging because it engages with a community and creates bonds. And the third example would be people that go to the Whitby Gothic Festival every year to the Abbey in England, right? So, again, temporally limited, taking on fictional persona, different clans of vampires, different types, and of course it's based on Bram Stoker's Dracula as the frame of reference. So,
do you how do you consider immersion coming in over the top of all of this, and how that affects this sensation of bleed and all the rest of it? Do you reckon there's a difference between, say, for example, a Tough Mudder event, which might be quite intense, and something where, like an intense LARP scene, where it's the immersion is significantly more and you're playing it as you're playing a different character?
This is a great question, and that is exactly the key. I think Bleed, there has been some changes in the last draft. So originally, the key to Bleed was exactly immersion. We called it narrative transportation because we're taking a narrative angle, but it's really immersion, the concept. So the more you're immersed, and immersion can be a function of both your engagement with the setting, but also with your character and interaction with other characters, the harder it is. And it's not only immersion within the LARP, that would be one factor, but also the tension that this immersion produces when you return to everyday life. And by tension, I mean if you're immersed in a character that makes you realize you can be a great person, you can be a great hero, you discover abilities that you never really understood about yourself because you were never in that situation to try them out. And then you're dissatisfied of your current role in society or in your current community, Bleed intensifies, right? So it's not just immersion, which is a key driver, but also the intensity between those two things.
So a real world example would be you go to a LARP weekend where you play a senior member of nobility or something, where you are constantly asked your advice and your decisions have lots of power and agency, and then you go back to your Monday job and your supervisor's arguing with you why you're 5 minutes late for your shift type thing. I'm assuming that's what you mean by like that kind of jarring sensation, you know?
Yeah, that would be a good example, I guess. That would be a good example.
Yeah. Do you want to talk maybe about the process of writing the paper before we kind of get to some of the more conclusionary elements of it? Like, how did you find interacting with different LARP communities and asking these questions? And
Oh, that was beautiful. So in the process of writing it, the interaction with our informants is probably the most amazing part of it, because I mean, literally, the methods we used is not just like interviews and post-LARP diaries, but we did a lot of archival research. We did observations during the preparations of the LARPs. So maybe in Dracarys 2016, we had like 9 months of preparation on the forum before at the actual event. So players could actually talk with each other, coordinate on the house's appearance, and develop other plots. So you're playing while you're doing it. And again, like part of my job is also being a participant observer. So playing the LARP for me is also a way of getting data in observing people's interaction, but also understanding through my body and my senses how this happens, because bleed ultimately is an embodied feeling, right? It's not like purely mental. Like it affects you emotionally, you feel a weight in your chest for a week. So that is great. And we were very fortunate. We collaborated with 2 organizations, which I would like to shout out because they also organize amazing LARPs. The first is Terra Spezzate from Italy, and the other is Not Only LARP from Spain. And they were so open and so gentle. And I think that speaks a lot about how LARPers and in general role-playing gamers are communal when it comes to raising awareness about what they do is not that weird at all. Because again, like for somebody that started role-playing in the 90s, and for everybody who has watched Stranger Things and read about the Eddie Munson character, like it was not always cool, right, to be a nerd. So anything that
we're still in a weird place when it comes to LARP, right? Like, because before, if I ever mentioned that I was playing D&D with people that didn't do any nerdy stuff, it would be like almost like an eye roll or something completely alien or something that you wouldn't ask a second question about, right? Like, but now obviously I feel like, I think COVID had a big effect on this. I think Stranger Things, even like you go back to things like Lord of the Rings, but LARP still lives in a very weird place. One, it's very small, it's very niche, right? Like, but also I don't think many people come into contact with it, or society really allows the idea of open play like that. I think it's something that people, many societies still very much struggle with, right? One thing that you did mention in what you just said just then, and which I found really interesting when I was reading the paper, was the idea of the this online relationship that's now developed, right? Like, be that through Facebook groups, Discord, and other things. It's part of the community aspects as well as like enhancing the live experience when you go through the communities that you kind of set up, you know?
No, it is. And I think one of the reasons why it evolved is precisely COVID. I mean, like through COVID, we couldn't LARP anymore, and we couldn't even, especially, it has been bad throughout the world, but in Melbourne, we did 276 days of lockdown. So no Dungeons and Dragons for anybody. So we started just like playing, and how we retain our mental sanity was just like playing via Discord. So it's amazing that like even if you are far away or isolated for different reasons, you have digital platforms that support you. And the community element as well, I think, has changed both public opinion but also the quality of play in general, because now you are exposed to to examples of what is a great costume, a great visual outfit, examples of how setting up locations in a stunning, evocative way so that it facilitates immersion. You can watch videos, you can see what are quality interactions, you have discussion forums on what it means to play to lose rather than play competitively, so people understand that LARP is more than a hobby, is more than a just play, it's a discover of yourself through theatrical improvisation. And to do that, you have to allow yourself to lose, and other people have to allow other people the space to express those scenes. So
what you just said just then is something that I think a lot of LARPers still need to learn. In fact, it took me a while. I think creating a character that can roll wands, and I mean that even if that's a physical, you're out in the field and you mess up so badly, I very much agree, and I think that's a wonderful observation about roleplay that you want to sometimes not playing. If you are reliant on that character being a hero, then sometimes you won't be, and then you'll have a terrible time. So being able to create a character that's a bit more three-dimensional is, I think, deeply important to getting the most out of a roleplay experience, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only that, I think also, Levy, understanding that everybody has to be the protagonist. So you can't dominate a scene, especially when there is a big LARP. The risk is some people that are a little bit more outgoing and experienced may cut some of the space. And I think that the best players I've seen are the ones that, even if they're very experienced, even if they can carry a scene for an hour by themselves, they deliberately lose, they deliberately give the space to other players to actually make the best out of their characters out of that scene.
Oh, that would be a wonderful world if we lived in it, honestly.
I think very hard. Right? It's also very hard to do, not with our characters, but with our egos, and that is like a terrible beast.
For me, I think I've had a recent feeling with this character that I'm playing at the moment at Empire, where I really like the narrative. So it's like a change of perspective. Instead of the character and myself being so aligned, maybe a slightly turned up version of myself, and my goals are very similar to my character's goals. Now I'm much more interested in the narrative of my character's journey rather than trying to take it on personally, and that's enabled to free me to enjoy the game significantly more in a whole bunch of things. It creates it so I'm more willing to take risks and enjoy all aspects of the game, be that a win or a loss. So I think that's personally where I am now a very good attitude to come to the game with.
And transformational potential as well, right? The more you play somebody that's detached from yourself, the more you can explore things that you will never be exposed to, or values and ideas. So and that can be done at the character level, but also the LARP level, depending on the theme. One of the reasons why I loved Conscience in Spain is that I never thought about human-machine interaction. I never thought, if tomorrow we reach the singularity and we have sentient robots, would I treat them as humans or machines? And it took me 3 days and a lot of tears collectively with the other players to understand that probably as people.
I like that. Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds like a good game. That sounds like a really fun game.
That was if you ask around, any player of Conscience was very moved by. I have to say it was the most transformational LARP of my life, and I hope they do reruns because it's in a beautiful setting, in a movie set in the desert of Almeria in Spain, and the themes are just not just human robot interactions, but about what defines conscience in a human, and other things, abuse and salvation and other quite mature themes, but worth exploring.
Yeah, I think this is an area that is constantly being pushed into in the wider international LARP community. There are some things that are distasteful and some things that aren't. Those things vary from community to community and potentially who's doing them and who's observing them. So there's a lot of pitfalls and things to be careful of. But me personally, I'd like pushing myself to find out, putting myself in different situations and different role play environments that are transformative to me as a human being, right? A development of myself. I've had, I think about some of the recent relationships that I've had with players I've never met before at the start of the weekend, and had very intense emotional times with them that have made me question all sorts of things about my personal identity, which I would have never expected before going in. All of which was I consider to be a very, very like valuable experience, because it's just exploring new parts of myself that I wasn't fully aware, because I was playing when I say role, I mean like a society role, right? Like we all kind of have our own lane that we go in our normal life. So exploring those in a safe environment with others in role play is deeply rewarding, in my opinion. I don't know whether you know much about the academics of the benefits of LARP and some of the pitfalls as well.
Well, in terms of what we found, or in general, whether I'm aware of.
You can just discuss. We don't need to. It doesn't need to be a grand jury on this. We can just talk.
On the pitfalls, we'll talk later, because that's also a very interesting aspect. They kept asking us on the dark side of LARP, but I didn't want to write a paper on the dark side of LARPs. That can be a different book. And it's a book instead of paper, because there's so much dark in that since the 90s to now.
We have enough. We have enough moral panic, right? Like we don't need any more on certain subjects.
Exactly. But as you mentioned, like in the moment in which you start discussing quite mature thematics with certain dynamics, bad things can happen. And luckily, most of the good organizers I know, they implement consent techniques and negotiation I've ever seen, so that's limited. But I also heard horror stories from other points. But on the takeaways of LARP, well, there's many. I'll just take. I don't want to be self-referential, but I just know these too well because I've worked on them for years.
It's a LARP podcast. Don't worry about it. Like you can go as indulge yourself. You know?
The first, which can be used even with employers, is that actually LARPs make you a better employee. They equip you with a better capacity of reacting to uncertain situations. Like when you LARP, you develop improvisational skills. You move from a reactive style to a proactive style. And based on whether you're a collaborative or a competitive player, that may require more or less time. But what we discuss in that other paper on in Administrative Science Quarterly, which is called Developing Improvisational Skill, is exactly that. We look at how people that are LARPing Vampire for the years are able to develop a range of skills that are very useful when you are in a business situation, when you are in an organizational unit, because you don't have to be a firefighter or a SWAT team member. Like, sorry for the French, but shit happens all the time in every corporation, right? And you have to be ready and prepared. And if you have that skill, you can make sense of that and act on your feet. And a LARPer does that all the time. When you LARP, by definition, you have to design the game as a very intense movie. So stuff and cues happen and pop out everywhere, and you have to quickly react and adapt. So that is what we've wrote in that. And the other one, very briefly, is the transformational aspect of being exposed to different situations. So what we wrote in the JCR paper on Bleed is that this process of returning and the emotional drag that ensues allows you to question some ideas on yourself, as you were saying before, on your role. So, okay, I was playing the nobleman, and now my boss is scolding me like, but is this the position I want? COVID is not a LARP, but is an example of an extreme situations that question a number of roles and settings, and after which, upon returning, people started, do I really want to live in a small apartment? Do I really want to work a job that doesn't really mean much to me? And so you have other, maybe that's not necessarily Bleed, but if we accept that we can translate Bleed from LARPs to broader extraordinary experiences, and we make the epic assumption that COVID was quite an extraordinary experience, then you can explain the Great Resignation for Bleed. Like suddenly something has questioned.
I think the connection is very, very good, which I haven't thought of it that way. But both are, I consider both in my head before you drew the parallel as mirrors, right? COVID was a mirror, LARP is a mirror. It's kind of like you're looking at yourself through these extraordinary circumstances, like you're saying, but it manages to really show you yourself, which can obviously be uncomfortable. Like I can't imagine what it was like for some people that had to stay inside like I live in a flat, but I'm lucky I have green spaces nearby me. For many people's experience, that wouldn't have been the case in relationships that weren't ideal, for example. I think LARP maybe has those aspects of being able to show yourself through and give yourself a real good opportunity to have a good look at yourself in those circumstances and see how you feel about yourself, you know?
Yeah, I think so. Good and bad, right? Like sometimes you also can feel very bad if you, we had many informants reporting they were playing the bad character or the evil character, or they wanted to explore specific aspects of morality that luckily we cannot explore in daily life. And there was a LARP a girl was describing. It was during the liberation in Italy from the Nazis, and she was playing the Nazis, and she had like a catharsis because what she recounted is that like it was terrible not because of the historical aspect, but because I realized that we were not the bad guys. We thought we were doing good, and it's a terrible thing to realize, right? That probably most of these people were just part of a society that was dystopian. There were some very evil people at the top of it with very deviant objectives, but then you can't condemn an entire nation with 78 million people, right? Those people are just
what's the thing? There's never been an offensive war in history. Every single war has always been defensive for some reason. Yes. We have to do this now, otherwise later on something. We're the ones under threat right now. So yeah, it's everyone's the hero of their own story, even the villains, right? So. I think like I'm still very much looking to get to more LARPs and play more characters, and I feel like I have a lot more character and a lot more that I want to explore with it. Recently I went to a cowboy western LARP, and I was trying to play a bad guy, and it's so difficult for me to be a really nasty human being. I know that sounds very self-reverential, but like I really struggled, and it's like I had to kind of try and give myself rules and trying to be a bad guy and trying to get into it. But even then, I don't know how bad I was, like or how bad you should be with a player experience sometimes when you're playing with other people, right? It's interesting. I don't know.
I think it speaks to the fact that the concepts of good and evil are really complex, right? Like Dungeons and Dragons has a very historically really neat distinction. You have a paladin which is lawful good, and then you have a blackguard which is lawful evil, and that's it. But I think in reality it's more complex. It's a matter of perspective. So the beauty of LARP is that it allows you to explore those psychological aspects, because you have so many interactions that you can't most of the time, unless you're a very stereotypical character, be 100% evil, right? Or 100% good. There will be always some slips, and so the whole concept that you're good or bad evolves. I'm thinking about Thanos in Infinity Wars. Like, was he evil? I don't know.
Yeah, I think he was, but I know what you mean though. The kind of I think that's what makes most makes compelling characters generally. Okay, like and also interestingly, an actual big problem with the Marvel franchise as an entirety is they tend to have very boring one motivated characters, and Thanos stands out particularly because he's so interesting. He has relationships with his daughters. He has good intentions with terrible methods. Like, this is what makes a great character either way, right? Like, good or bad.
I agree, and I think they ended it as they started it. Like what saved Marvel really, and what also saved Disney later on, is when they acquired Marvel Enterprises was Iron Man. And Iron Man is such a great character because yes, he's a I don't remember the quote, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist, genius, but he's also an alcoholic. He's also like a war merchant. He's also he's egomaniac. So you have all this good and bad, and yes, he's good, but of course he has weaknesses, which is what makes characters relatable, because we all have.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I would like to bring to pretty much every character I play in future, would be, if they're a good character, make them have flawed beliefs and all that stuff, right? Like, in fact, that's often when we're talking about role play, is what makes good game, is that conflict between two characters thinking that they're doing the right thing, or whatever that might be. That's when really interesting stuff. Do you know what it reminds me of? What we're talking about right now is... and this is a really nerdy tangent I'm about to go on, but when they were talking about the Star Trek Next Generation, when that was being made, when they were writing certain episodes in that have very, very complex moral discussions about who you are and outcomes of your actions and all the rest of it, a lot of the time they would be arguing in the writer's room about which one was right and which one was wrong, and not even coming to an actual conclusion by the time they would have to break up their writers' meeting. And those were always the episodes that were so good, because even the people that were effectively being the creators of the narrative, couldn't agree on what was the right or wrong decision of some things like that. So, yeah, again, where the danger lives, but also where very interesting development things personally can live, right?
Yeah, and I think that also is the same reason why I think Game of Thrones was very popular, on top of like killing characters that you love. But also, apart from Ned Stark, nobody's good, right? Or necessarily. There are different degrees of evil, but everybody in their own way commits what they have to do in order of following their storylines and objectives. So it gives depth to characters and it allows you to make them more real. So no, it's a great thing. Then again, Stranger Things is the opposite, right? Most characters are good or evil, and that's I think it's a balance, right? When
But
entertainment comes out, you need both.
But interestingly, though, you could argue, and this is controversial. I'm going to try and avoid any spoilers, by the way, if you're listening to this and like, oh my god, Dave's about to drop this thing. I would say that maybe the issue is that some of even the good characters with good intentions are not punished for their mistakes as much as they potentially should be in Stranger Things as time goes by, and therefore some of the weight on some of the more intense emotional scenes are detracted by a bit of plot armor, which is the same thing that kind of happened to Game of Thrones, right? Like, what we like to see is if a character, and Ned Stark's the absolute poster child for this, because he was so focused on one thing and his morals and wasn't grey, that's what made him weak in this world. And I think that's kind of maybe what's lacking in some narrative, that we don't want to have all of our heroes to be perfect, right? Like, we want them to be flawed. If you look at, I mean, that whole wave of the mid-2000s with Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, all of these, like, all of their main characters are all horrible people, but, like, people loved them, you know? So, yeah. I suppose that's what you're trying to do as a character as well, because I know LARP characters that are, on all intents and purposes, are villains, but they're loved by the community. They're cheered on as they slime their way through their game, you know?
I think Littlefinger was one of the favorite characters, and even the very first Dungeons and Dragons character, I forgot the name, but like the guy that was playing with Gary Gygax solo, he was a lawful evil warrior. Forgive me for I should know this, but I forgot it. He was like loved and celebrated and has become an NPC in future manuals, but he was inherently probably not a great player and very evil. But then again, I don't know, there is some fascination with a certain type of evil, I guess. The lawful evil alignment, particularly. Because everybody like sees chaotic evil is like, oh, that's really bad. But lawful evil is a little bit most of our politicians probably are lawful evil anyway, so we are more accustomed to that kind of reasoning than others. Well, this is an overstatement, so.
No, I like that. I think the lawful evil is my boogeyman. Like that's the thing that motivates me to fight and go against, is like what's that character in Harry Potter when they take over the school and they get that lady to be the new headmistress of the school or whatever, and she's very law and order and by the book, but in the most evil way possible, controlling, irrational, judgmental, all those things, you know. So yeah, that's my antithesis for sure. Like as an adversary, that's always good fun, you know, if you find one of those, a lawful evil. Maybe let's bring it back a little bit towards the paper and Bleed. Let's talk about let's start going into some sort of the general conclusions that you managed to draw. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the two different types of bleed that you kind of, there were a bunch of different types, but specifically, I don't want to get the wording wrong. There were some lovely diagrams in the paper. Maybe you can just tell me what they are, you know, instead of me trying to guess.
Yes. So we labeled them dissociation and disembedding. Let me tell, there were more than two. We ended up with two because what we were more interested for the sake of that paper was looking at the trajectory of returning, but other scholars in the LARP discipline have discussed multiple types of bleed, and we had more, but the two that made it in the final cut are disembedding, and that is the sense of separation between yourself and the place you were. And by place, I don't mean only the location with its beautiful scenographies and whatnot, but also the immaterial place, the fantasy place, the setting that you have to overlay in that location to make the suspension of disbelief possible. So that is disembedding. When you come back, but you carry with you that sense of imaginary space. And then we have dissociation, which is the separation between you and your character in body, but not in mind. So you are another person, and now you drop off your costume, but there's still somewhere lingering in the corners of your mind a shadow of the person you've been for 3 days. And that is there and tells you what and who you were in those days, and sometimes calls for negotiation, like, was that character or can I learn something about me?
Can you maybe give some kind of real world, just for the listeners, of what examples of what they would be, maybe, just to clarify what you mean?
Of course, like I'll give you like real life example that happened after Conscience. So an example of disembedding was not just like missing tremendously the beautiful set in which we were, because it was an entire Western city, but also some of the instinct that I developed in those 3 days, right? So I was at a bar with another player, and suddenly we hear a bang, like something fell, and I instantly went with my hand to my gun that was no longer there, looking like a fool in the middle of the street, because that is what I did for the past 3 days. Like every 20 minutes there was somebody shooting, and I developed this thing, okay, reach for your gun. So that will be a trace of the habits and the instincts that you develop while you're in the imaginary world.
I was about to say, this is really funny, because I was about to say, oh, well, I definitely haven't been affected by the first one, but maybe the second one. And I was just like, no, now you've that word. 100% have done that. I walk around with my my hand on my sword with my left hand, like it's, but it's not there. I'll pull my jacket back after I went to the cowboy LARP, like I had to have good, quick access to my gun if something was happening. Like really built-in reactions to stimulus outside. Yeah, sure, that's great. What about the other one?
Well, association is barely easier even. It's just you've been another person for 3 days, and if you didn't break character, you had to behave in ways that most of the time are different from yours. So when you come back, you have this overlap between you and your role. So you're sitting in the office, you're trying to write, and flashes, images, thoughts about the character come through, and you start lingering with your mind and reflecting on the people that you met, who they were, because sometimes you play a LARP and you don't even meet people, you meet characters, and then you don't really, to what extent is this person the character. So the process of dissociating between you and the character, but also the people that you meet and their character, is what we put into the dissociation label.
Very much had this. In fact, I had an interesting conversation. I went to it was a friend of mine's birthday, a LARPer photographer, and I went down and met a whole bunch of other LARPers. And one of the things I was talking to them about was like, when you spend a weekend with a group of people, especially at the smaller, say 50-person events, where you kind of get a good feel of everyone else there, and you can have some pretty intense moments. But them being strangers to you, and despite having these very intimate moments throughout the weekend, or intense moments, by the time that the weekend comes to end, they're still a stranger to you, or are they, right? Like how much of that experience was their character, or how much of it was them behind their character? It's a bit of a head fuck when you really think about it, you know?
It is. In 2016, we were playing the Tyrells, House Tyrell, and we were really amazing. I loved it. Everybody was so passionate and interactive and generous in their improvisational cues. And then the week after, we organized a retreat in a house. Somebody had a large house, and that was literally a mindfuck because it looked like, oh wow, there's 12 strangers, and it was so awkward at the beginning because, okay, so hi, I'm.
And you're not wearing your protective shield of character, right? So if anyone was playing, and I assume most people are going to go from, very few players are going to go from confident to nervous, right? Like as a character transition, most people are going to try and go for, I'm quite an anxious person, but I'm going to try and play more of a confident person. I think that's a fair statement to say. So I assume everyone's dropped their characters, they're dropping their shield and their drive to engage confidently, you know. So that's kind of an interesting thing, you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But there was an Italian poet, Luigi Pirandello, that he was not a LARPer because they did not exist, but he wrote about the fact that each one of us wears a mask every day. And the masks that we live in our everyday life are particularly complex because we only have that, right? It's not like in a LARP, you can always change it, right? You only have this in everyday life and you have to manage it
I think
cautiously.
that's. I think I that very, very true. Very, very true. And in fact, it's something that I wish I'd learnt to do earlier was to be able to play around with this mask and swap it out because I find it so unbelievably rewarding. Even when I've been playing silly characters, in it like one LARP, I played like a French noble character and I spoke with in a terrible French accent for the entire weekend. Complete comedy character, really, really silly. But even that character had beautiful, touching moments that affected me deeply afterwards. And part of me was like, wow, there's some. It's fun playing a lovable buffoon and then realizing like, oh, well, maybe I should actually take some of these characteristics on myself. Maybe I do take myself too seriously, and if someone walked past me as Jean-Michel Dubois, I would if someone called me an idiot, I would immediately act outraged, but it would rub water off a duck's back by after 5 minutes, right? And I think like maybe there's some aspects of that I would love to take onto myself and be like, hey, I'm awesome, and it doesn't matter what other people say. I can be outraged and then get on with my day.
Well, I think this is really something we should all treasure that. As you said, most people tend to take themselves very seriously, and I think LARPs helps to diminish that. And I think we will live much better if we took ourselves a little bit less seriously, or at least not bother other people that wish to do so, which has been the drama and the tension between the broader community and in general people that role play for the past 30 years, I guess. But hopefully it gets better.
I'm completely confident it will. There's no, there is no. Oh no, we're gonna. There may be, but like it's society has moved past that, right? The Ockram's window, whatever was the not Ockram's window, was the anyway. The framing of what we are and how we interact with the world and what we enjoy has changed completely. And there's just too much information to say that it's a negative thing, right? Like I think if you had a whole campaign done by we have a pretty strong press in the UK that kind of like can pretty much dominate any issue it wants to. So if you did manage to get the ire of some of those larger papers, potentially you could have some moral panic. But generally, I think like most people know, us going off to the fields and having a good time is only really beneficial, and the harm involved is, compared to say a music festival, for example, when the stuff that goes on at music festivals is truly shocking and criminal, I would say a lot more of the those aspects are unfortunately ubiquitous, but when you have like large volumes of people coming together, unfortunately. Whereas I find actually in a LARP society, those tend to be a lot more self-governed. There's a lot more protections in place for those players, hopefully, in whichever LARP you go to. So the community aspect, I think, is a bit better at kind of like mitigating some of those society problems,
Oh, I agree. The community aspect of LARP and the fact that you play, so it's a form of escape from current problems or just like tiredness and boredom. But the fact that you're doing that collectively towards a specific goal is, I think, a type of positive escape as opposed as to other negative, I don't know. Drugs would be an example of very negative escape. Can be collective but mostly individualistic, and it's destructive because you are escaping your consciousness, but with something that has very negative long-term effects and also unpleasant short-term ones most of the time.
Yeah, I think I've often questioned, I mean, even in the last couple of years, I've questioned how healthy my love of escapism is. Do I enjoy becoming a different character too much? Do I like disappearing? Oh, pardon me, a very serious point there. I burp in the middle of it. But the idea of like, am I ignoring reality by wanting to separate from myself and immerse myself in a different reality? After a long time thinking about it, it feels more like it's helping my version of reality is by role playing. It's the other way around from the kind of like reactionary view of trying to escape would be. In fact, it's making me significantly stronger in the real world by role playing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And that is the final point in the paper, the transformational trajectories that we discussed, that LARPing and Bleed can be a positive transformational force when it creates a tension with the game and the everyday, when it allows, as you say, to reflect on yourself or to reflect on situations in which you are every day and you're dissatisfied with. That allows a transition that can discover new perspectives on issues you never confronted before, and ultimately, hopefully, makes you a better person. So, I completely agree. That is exactly what we wrote as the conclusion of that paper.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'll just let you kind of. I think I could ask you a leading question, but I think maybe you could just tell us some of the conclusions of the paper, and kind of, if you're happy with those conclusions, if you're not happy with those conclusions, and what you want to kind of do next. Really, I'll just give you the floor. Really, if you want to just go for it.
Yeah, well, again, like the last takeaway we included, last finding was trying to not just understand what are the forces of bleed, the different types of bleed, and how it can get more intense depending on your level of satisfaction with your role or with your current situation, with your embeddedness in the everyday. It was also to see, based on different bleed intensities, what is your journey back. So we were looking at you can just participate in a LARP and have zero bleed. Bleed is not a given. A lot of people don't bleed at all. They just enjoy the experience, but they take it as like entertainment and escapism. That's completely fine. Some other people feel the trace of this embedding and dissociation, but what they do is they miss a lot the setting and the characters. So maybe they're trying to compensate that by accessing them by playing again, or accessing cultural materials that are based on that. So if I play the Game of Thrones LARP and I'm really missing the Westeros, I'm gonna play the card game, I'm gonna rewatch the episodes and whatnot. And that is a form of compensatory access that does not necessarily require me LARPing, but what it allows me to do is to negotiate my relationship with the setting, with the lore. But the one we are most interested with is the cathartic return, the one in which bleed has created a tension with your everyday life and you have to negotiate it. You have to ask questions about who you are, you have to question what you do, what you believe in, and if the result of this process is a moment of enlightenment or a little piece of understanding of who you are and where you want to be, then you have achieved one of the greatest things a LARP can give you, which is a moment of growth. There's also negative into that. Sometimes there's a little bit too much growth. Somebody that has very problematic situations at home. People we interviewed, and we'll keep it anonymous, but people that were in abusive relationships or people that suffer divorce or other things, and then they happen to play a character that had divorced, and that can create triggers, right? So then the bleed is a little bit too much and you have a delayed process. It will take much more than a week to process all of this. And also probably help from other people around you. The good thing of LARPing is that it's communal. So in LARPs in which you discuss strong themes, the role of the community and the role of organizers in creating the briefings is very pivotal for, let's say, a successful transition. But even if those are the premises, you can still have a moment of realization. And we were very happy to see that one of these people that was in this abusive relationship managed to break out, and 2 years later we recontacted her, and she basically exited, and she and her kids were safe and sound away, and she basically recovered. So that's also very good. And if a LARP did that, that is great, honestly.
Yeah, hell yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think like the problem is like we all come into life with trauma, and we're all have our backstories, our real world backstories. One thing I find is whenever I've played a LARP character, even if at the time I've been like, this character is so different from me. Wow, they're just like, I'm so pleased with myself that I've managed to create this character that's nothing like me at all. And then after time playing the character, or after time having been away from the character, I'll look at the character again and be like, oh my god, it's just it's a giant allegory for me, right? Like it's one. I just didn't view it from the right angle when I was looking at it when I created the character, but so many aspects of that character. I personally have had deeply affirming moments, or at least being made aware of not issues. I can't think of a better word than issues, but like the kind of social pressures that I've put on myself or previous experience that I've put on myself, and being able to view it through like an abstraction layer. So I managed to work through certain, and again, if you're actually suffering from severe psychological trauma in any way, go and see a professional, but I'm just talking anecdotally here. But the being able to observe some of those small t traumas through the abstraction layer of roleplay, when I wasn't even conscious of the factors that those were the issues I was talking about. Like you talk about like the divorce character playing the divorced person playing a divorced character. Well, you might end up playing that character, but with something that you can't even put that as a solid link together, right? So you might be role playing an aspect of yourself. Deal with that trauma, and then only after, when you come back from the event, you're like, holy shit, like did I just did I just learn like a whole bunch about myself and kind of change my thought pattern behavior on certain aspects, or at least for a moment having conscious clarity of something that you might be able to develop in the future, right? And I think it's interesting that I constantly have to caveat this. Like, this isn't the first time I've talked about like the beneficial aspects of going to LARP, and also some of the pitfalls to it. But constantly having to like caveat the fact is that like this is not a magic bullet, right? Like this is, in fact, I did a good interview recently with a person called Kay, and they put forward that it's like, in addition to professional help, it's very, very good. So addition rather than the main the main source of therapy is very important. But if you don't feel like therapy is your issues are serious enough for therapy, or you're just a regular person. And also I would say, when I talk about mental health, I talk about everyone. Like I'm talking about me, I'm talking about you, I'm talking about the listeners at home. I'm talking about like everybody has mental health. Everyone has mental health, and we all have interactions with it differently. And I don't think there's any harm in developing those skills, even if you think, oh, I'm really happy with life, right? Like your life you should always, like in my opinion, developing, learning, improving, adapting is the stuff that makes life itself worthwhile living, you know?
100%. And of course, LARPs are not a substitute to therapy, but they can do really great things. They can spot a problem that you didn't even realize you had, because they can expose you to those situations that may act as triggers. And look, truth be told, LARP is basically, it was developed as a psychodrama. Like Jacob Moreno developed LARPing as a way of facing your demons in a theatrical way. And if you go even back further in time, in general, like rites, ritualistic, ceremonial rites, are all a way of representing certain demons that we want to face and make real, because as long as they're in our head, it's harder to face them. But like when you represent them, and when you can actually put them in a space, in a character, it becomes much easier to reflect on those. So yes, you cannot substitute professional help, but surely is something that can give you some insights on not necessarily a problem, but something you may wish to work on to become a better human being. Because
yeah, at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and there is a kind of like a psychological, like, bear in mind, I'm not an academic, so I'm just going to use words that I think might make sense, but like a kind of the psychological mechanics of being a human being, right? Like we have our physical mechanics, but there's also a mental side of our mechanics. Now we're all very different, but there are certain things that we can all do. Like I find it funny, and I like bringing this up as an example of why people like horror movies. Okay, like we like to watch horror movies, and we like to scare ourselves, and we like to simulate that sensation of fear, right? Like we don't want to actually be scared, but we like to simulate the idea of being scared, and we like to live in those spaces and enjoy being scared with friends around us in a safe environment. And that's I like bringing up horror movies because it's an interesting way to approach LARP, because both are immersive, and just because I'm role-playing a thing doesn't mean I necessarily actually in the real world want anything to do with that. I don't want to be don't go to war and have a bloody experience and all that stuff, and I don't want to die, and I don't want to kill other people, right? But within the safe environment of narrative, those mental mechanics I can start to kind of play around with in a fun environment. And like, how good is that? Like, you get to self-improve yourself and learn new hard skills, as well as learn things about yourself, but you get to do it while having fun. Like, this is what a wonderful hobby LARP is. Like, what a treat.
No, and I love the parallel with horror movies because it's exactly like that. They're very similar. They're very intense, thrilling, potentially threatening, but you don't die, right? You can. There is a beautiful song by Tool called "Vicarious." It's about we have a need of that threat of seeing things that are perilous, but from a safe distance. And being the distance from the TV or the distance from the two worlds that LARP and LARPing and everyday life are, that allows us exactly to do that, to exercise our fears and demons and to explore a little bit more about ourselves.
Well, conflict's important, right? Like, like I know the majority of people I'm speaking to live in the West, or you're Westerners living in different parts of the world. Like, this is kind of my understanding of our listener base. We have pretty good lives. I very rarely worry about being hungry or feeling unsafe or any of these very real world things. And I'm not saying these are, oh, how lucky people are that live with these things in their lives, right? But there are aspects to when how do I describe this without being mean? Like, your life can become very bland without any rough edges in it, right? Like, and you can start to become wayward in your own life if there is no challenge and no interest and no agency. Agency, I think, is actually the more important word out of the ones I just described. It's the kind of lack of going down a single path in your life. And I think like LARP is one of those aspects that will really help. It doesn't even need to make the change. It can just be the experience that is important to mitigate some of the things that you might be missing in the rest of your life potentially. I don't know whether I completely agree with that, but it's an interesting point.
The beauty is that like every LARPer is different, and we LARP for different motivations. So there are people that LARP to bleed, they seek actively bleed, they want to be challenged, they want to experience transformation. I really like what you said about, like, paraphrasing, happiness is not really useful, right? Nobody has ever grown from being content. By definition, I'm content with my current situation, I'm not gonna change it, right? So it's like it's through sadness that you have catharsis and growth. But then there are other LARPers that just do it for fun, and other ones that just do it as an escape because they're very dissatisfied. I have met some of the dark examples of people that are not so great people, even if the majority of humanity I've met is wonderful. There's a couple of rotten apples, and they use LARPs as a way of expressing those frustration in the game. That is something nobody really wants. But
there's lots of aspects to this, like be it a LARP game, and like, oh, I always choose to be the baddie, or I come up with an excuse to be to reduce other players' experience is basically what I'm saying, right? Like, you can be a baddie and enhance other people's experiences, or you can be a baddie and just reduce game and make people's weekends worse. And you're doing that because if you're angry at yourself, you're angry at the world, blah blah blah. Like, these are things that like, what we're talking about here is toxic play, right? And this can come down to other stuff like your gender's opinion of a different gender, for example, is a very common one. That people might want to lash out on a field or feel that they can do that because they're in a game, and it's like that I find well, unbelievably bad, basically. But it does happen. But at the same time, I'll talk about this. My own interaction with women in and how they are. The one thing that I learned from LARP was men talking over women. It happens all the time, and like, LARP is the thing that really hammered that home to me in a very real world setting. In my normal life, it probably does come up, but in LARP, it's painfully obvious because everyone's very passionate and wanting to engage and wanting to and they want to be verbose and get their point across. But unfortunately, it tends to be a lot of women that they talk over, which is a huge problem. But it made me very deeply aware of that when I'm listening to conversation at LARP. And I don't know whether I would have such a good understanding of that in my head now if I didn't have the education I had through playing games like Empire, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I played in 2019 a LARP called Demetra, and it was about gender dynamics, and it was in a future alternative society in which gender balances were swapped. So women were in power, they were more physically strong, they were in positions of they were in the clergy, the Pope was a woman, and all men were weak, frail, and they died at the age of 35. And it was a
Yeah,
beautiful story.
yeah, we did the original sin. We were foolish and didn't listen to the wisdom of our female counterparts and ate the apple and released sin into the world. All of that stuff, right? Like when you start playing around with this, I'm like, oh my god, there's so many fucking problems with what you're describing right now. But most of me is like, this sounds amazing. Like I also think like I want to have the right organization. I want to be with the right players, and I want to have the right safety measures in place to play a game like that. But in theory, I don't see any issue beyond if those things are all in place. That game sounds amazing, right? Like
Of course, you have a lot of consent and other things, but it's great because it forces a lot of men that never reflected on toxic masculinity in general, stereotypes that are embedded in patriarchal society, to realize actually how in many situations there's not a parity which should be there. So for some cultural differences, I played the international run, and that was great. I heard that the purely Italian run, which tends to be a little bit more masculine, was not so good because there was a cultural resistance to embrace the opposite roles. So, and that also speaks about the reason why you need these LARPs that deal with current issues, right? With history, with war.
even if you're pushing, even just the idea of swapping genders begs the question: what are we swapping? Okay, like and that is a deeply philosophical conversation anyway, and could be like some of the outcomes of that conversation would be quite offensive to people, right? Like, so
Let me clarify. In the LARP they didn't swap genders; they swapped
sorry.
the gender dynamics, right?
Yes.
So men were still, but they were like in a weaker. It was like isn't a different alternative take to the 60s in the US, so to say, in which you will have the stereotypical man in the kitchen doing the dishes while the woman is, I don't know, smoking a pipe and reading the newspaper. Like, that very stereotypical image from the 60s, but swapped and embedded into a spy story that goes on to, I don't want to spoil it because they may rerun it, but it makes question the gender balance dynamics of our current days. But yeah, as you said, it requires, of course, as every LARP that deals with mature themes, negotiation of scenes and safety mechanics and everything that is related to that.
I also want to play games where I want to push myself for sure. Like there's no way I want to I enjoy LARPing casually, but I really enjoy hardcore roleplay. Like I want to learn as much as I can about myself, and often that can be pretty hardcore LARPs. The range out there is vast. And you can come into contact with extremely adult and extremely thought-provoking subject matter that many people won't feel comfortable. So if you're listening to this and you are going to these different LARPs, and then bear in mind there's no LARP license. You don't need a license to do a LARP. Anyone can do a LARP. So if you are going to these sort of events, read their terms and conditions, try and get an idea for the culture base that you're going into. Often their Facebook groups will give a very clear indication of sort of what culture is acceptable and what culture isn't. So I'd highly recommend, if you are going on this journey for more intense things, then try and be careful. Be safe is basically what I'm saying,
Do your research, right? The community is open enough. You can know who the organizers are and what the themes. A lot of these very popular LARPs were launched. Well, now COVID has disrupted it, but like Inside Hamlet, I think it's a very potentially disturbing LARP, very transformative, but they're like very strong scenes. I've been told. I've never played it, but every player that has played that tells me it's the most intense LARP they ever played. And so you can just like talk with people that have already played it and understand without spoilers, like what are the level, what's the zone of discomfort that every LARP has, right? The big zone, the greater transformation, but of course everybody has a limit.
Yeah, I've kind of got to this point now where I'm starting to recognize similar faces. And I know this sounds kind of dumb, but even the player base, which actually it's not even dumb. The player base is actually incredibly important. These are the people that you'll be playing with each weekend. People I don't even know. They wouldn't even know who I am by name. They might know me by sight, but I've got a good understanding of, especially because of the online side of things, who's going to an event, what sort of games I've been to with a similar sort of crowd, and it gives me a lot of confidence when I'm going to an event that I see certain familiar faces, even if I don't know them personally. I've probably played games with them in the past. It's usually a sign that, hey, this is going to be a good game, right? Like the people are going to here are going to want to engage in a responsible manner, and I'm going to have a good time, like.
100%. I mean, like knowing the player base, these are the people with whom you have very deep interactions, right? So you want to have an idea, and even if you don't know them directly, you want at least to know somebody that knows them, because you never know, right? It just contamination theory is the theory that says it takes like just a minimal amount of something to spoil a large amount. It just needs like a drop of cyanide, right? So it just takes one one toxic player, and then if you have like another 50 player, that's 50 negative interactions that can spoil the game. So you want to make sure also there is not policing, but at least like keeping the community safe from certain characters.
Yeah, and this is the problem, like, and you're at your most vulnerable potentially when you first come into the hobby, because you're not aware of a lot of the social contracts that we have as players, right? Like if me as a more experienced player bumps into someone that I feel is clearly breaching social contract or breaking something fundamental that about what's happening, I'll either immediately, either if it's affecting another player, maybe step in. If it's affecting me, immediately evacuate myself from the situation, talk to a referee and just make sure everything's fine. But unfortunately, as a new player, that you are at the position when you are most vulnerable to having the most amount of bullshit that you can get, because I wouldn't tolerate that now. Whereas if I first came into a hobby and I was still trying to understand the dynamics of what I was doing, I might let more slide, which is unfortunate. But hopefully podcasts help. So who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, and times changing and people getting a little bit more conscientious. But there's nothing worse than ruining a new player that it's trying for the first time than having a bad experience because there is a toxic player.
Yeah. Let's talk about. We're probably not going to talk that much more about the academic stuff now. We're just going to chat because I'm enjoying myself. But let's talk a little bit about like the international stuff, because I've only LARPed in the UK. We've had a fairly big shift. I haven't been in the hobby for decades, but from what I understand, it's been much more inclusive, much safer. In fact, the quality has gone up significantly in the UK. There's just it seems to be an upward trend all across every metric that you could possibly hope to measure with UK LARP, and they all seem to be very, very positive over here. Is that your kind of experience, say in internationally, from your experience?
Say so, yes. I think then again, like bear in mind, it has evolved massively. I started LARPing in 2004, right? So things have changed a lot. I started LARPing internationally later on after 2016. But I remember at the beginning, some dynamics in the Mediterranean scene were not the best, right? So my experience internationally, especially with Nordic LARPs, has been excellent. I mean, all the LARPs that are influenced by the Scandinavian current tend to put great emphasis into safety conducts, negotiation of scenes, and anything social contracts that have to be in place before the game can start, and even after. They have very in conscience, and even in Demetra, they have these beautiful debriefing exercises that allow you to transition safely from the LARP into everyday life. So you have the LARP, it ends, but then you have like a gray zone, this liminal space in which you can say goodbye to your character, say goodbye to a character you are particularly connected to, and so on and so forth, conclude a scene that you didn't have the time to conclude. And in that sense, I have only to speak positive aspects. I was very lucky. I never had a direct experience. I have some horror stories, but directly I never had any issue. It was very respectful, very well organized, and in the end, all the players had the most amazing experiences.
I actually, my white whale is at the moment trying to find someone that's very knowledgeable about Nordic LARPs. I've come into contact with people that know stuff, but I really want to hit the fucking mother load. I don't know who this person is, but I need to speak to them.
Well, this person. Well, there's a few. There's a few. One would be Uzbase Regina. She's a consumer researcher as well, and she is she's also Scandinavian, so even country of origin effect. But she has written a lot about that, and she published a wonderful book called. It's about a negotiation between play and fantasy. It's a great book. I don't remember the name. Marcus Montola, I think, is another Scandinavian scholar. And then Sarah Bowman, she's another great academic. She focuses on LARPs and especially transformative LARPs. I think they recently started a YouTube series on the transformative power of LARPs.
How do you feel about the future of LARP? Like, I'm talking to you, just not an academic, as a player. Like, how are you feeling? Like, what do you feel about the future of LARP and feel where it could be in society in, say, 10, 20, 30 years, for example?
Very positive. We have already excellent examples of how LARP is used in education in Sweden. There's a lot of schools that use it as an educational tool. It's used also. Interestingly enough, like last month, I received an email from an agricultural company that wanted to organize a LARP on climate change and the effects on crops and for their employees. So it can be it's an excellent simulation tool. We've wrote a paper as a joke in 2019 called LARPnography, how actually LARPs are better than meetings in tackling issues. And actually it actually worked more than we thought, because some people listen to that. So I think LARP is great at individual level, because it's an instrument of growth, at an educational level because it can teach you long-lasting skills. But also as a method to probe the future, LARPs can really put yourself in a situation that you can have. Because we talk about a climate change, but try to do a LARP where the temperature is actually 5 degrees higher and just live your normal life. And then when you return, we will see whether that had an impact or not, because we know temperature and the high temperature is terrible for you, for the environment. You get more aggressive, interactions are more abrupt. So as a simulation tool, I think it will be increasingly used also in companies to tackle certain things. And again, companies as well, they use role-playing is used to simulate transaction and negotiations. So I think it will be more and more embedded and take the place that it deserves, because it's the best simulation tool we have, and we've been doing this since the Roman ages, so there's no reason why we should forget about it.
Even just hearing you talk just then, it's quite funny how we had to put in this digital interface for a lot of people to learn how to role play, and that's kind of be that through computer games, for example, like big MMOs online, and then now people playing D&D and stuff, but that's given people a little bit of distance, kind of want to do it live. We get I get a few messages from new players, and LARP certainly does seem to be the tonic. It's the opposite from lockdown. It's the exact polar opposite in my mind of what it felt like to be in lockdown is to LARP. It's physical, it's real, it's interactive on a like face-to-face level. I'm curious. I feel like there's a professional barrier that's holding back LARP at the moment. I don't know how to square this circle financially. Is to try and go away from a less volunteer-based system to a more professional, where everyone's paid, from the writers to the toilet attendants to the security to everyone else. And I don't know how the economics of that really works. Or whether that's something I actually want, which is the other thing about this, which is by the development and the potentially corporatification, is that even a word? But it's a word, right? And whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing, right? Like music festivals. I love music. Don't particularly enjoy going to large corporate music festivals very much. It's lost some of the things that I enjoy about going to those events. So I don't know. It's complicated, right?
Yeah, I think there's a parallel literature on that. If you think about Burning Man at the beginning, when it started, it was like 30, 40 people, and then it evolved in a massive mainstream phenomena in which brands which were outcasted at the beginning now sponsor it. So there's always this tension, right? There's always this tension between, yes, if you want to keep the content high, the numbers have to be small. If you want to make it mainstream, you have to compromise a bit on content. And also, professional, that is a whole episode on the professionalization of LARP groups. I met a couple, and until now, they didn't really do great, because the issue is that when you start doing it not as a volunteer but as a professional, you have to increase costs, right? You have to pay the writers, the scenographers, and that, of course, is an additional cost that goes on the people that come. So
and you're also like, these people are willing to do something for free anyway, right? Like if I talk about like, having all LARP so based on volunteering is problematic, but you'll find pretty much most volunteers will just respond with, I wouldn't get to go to LARP if I didn't give my time instead of that, so therefore it's a complete trade and I'm comfortable with that trade, right?
It is a hobby, true, but if you organize a LARP for 400 people and you're the main director, that becomes a job. So what I've not yet seen, and I hope that happens eventually, is for LARPs that are based on mainstream cultural products, right, like Game of Thrones or The Witcher, they can become a form of PR and promotion, right? So if you
hold on, you're talking about companies joining those two links up. That's not going to happen. Like.
That is my dream. It has never happened, but one day.
Yeah, one day. I agree with you 100%. Whether that will ever happen or there's some executive.
And the sets, and we'll do the rest.
Yeah, hopefully, right? Hopefully, this is where people like you come into the world and hopefully move this little shuffleboard on the extra few spaces that we need it to go on, right? I'm
very sorry, but I have to leave.
No, I'm also, I think I'm talked out, but I could literally talk to you for hours, and I hope one day that we get to do this in person, quite frankly. It's been a pleasure.
I'll be back in Europe next year, and hopefully I'll be able to LARP somewhere.
Is there anything that you wanted to kind of close with? Any kind of closing ideas or thoughts that you wanted to kind of put out there in the world just before we go?
Look, I don't want to be arid, but I think we discussed some pretty intense themes about the power that LARP has to be transformational. So I think it's that, really. If I can really close against the stereotypes, which, yes, we believe they are gone, but let me tell that once more. LARPers are great human beings that also have added improvisational skills. So if anything, those should be recognized rather than thrown on. And I know the situation gets better and better, but you always have, and I'm an academic that does not solely study LARP because nobody will take me seriously, right? I have a completely other consumer psychology research program based on communication processes, because when I present these things, some people still laugh, right? Because for them to see people in costumes is ludicrous, but there will always be these people, but hopefully less and less.
Hey, if you like Gandhi said, if be the change you want to see in the world, right? Like be the enlightened people walking through the world, and be an example of people that are cool that LARP, right? Like I think that's it. Thank you so much for your time. Basically, thank you to our patrons who get no benefits from supporting the podcast apart from facilitating me being able to talk to people like you. So thank you everyone for listening. We'll do this again soon. Hopefully we'll have more episodes like this because I don't know about you listening, but I've really enjoyed this conversation and getting into some pretty interesting topics. And if you do like this sort of thing, please let us know and we'll endeavor to try and chase those up. But we usually end with a call and response or some sort of outro line. Is there anything that you wanted to just say? I don't know. Is there an expression from a LARP you've been to or something? I don't know. So I've put you on a bit of a spot here.
I will just close with a quote that I love from one of the last LARPs I played in which I was playing a little finger, which is, chaos is a ladder.
Chaos is a ladder. Thank you, everyone.